Welcome back to Inside Your Ed. I hope you've all had a great start to 2026. Last year concluded with an action-packed autumn term of education policies, including the Curriculum and Assessment Review, a post-16 white paper, and a new levy on international students, along with several major announcements on extra funding for schools and families. But fear not, because this year is already poised to offer plenty more drama and debates. A schools white paper is expected in the coming weeks, including reforms to the Support for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, or SEND for short, and that all comes on top of simmering tensions over this year's teacher pay awards and Ofsted's controversial new inspection framework. To share his views on what is coming up in 2026, I'm delighted to be joined by Pepe Di'Iasio, the General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, which represents over 25,000 leaders in primary, secondary and post-16 education. I'm Tom Richmond, and to hear more about what lies ahead for teachers and leaders this year, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Pepe, welcome to Inside Your Ed and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Tom. Pleasure to be with you.
So here we are at the start of 2026, and we are certainly not short of things to talk about in terms of what awaits schools and colleges this year, some of which I think could be particularly challenging. But let's start with some of the good news that we've had in terms of funding, because towards the end of 2025, we had three big announcements: the removal of the two-child benefit cap, the extension of free school meals to more families, and extra investment in the new breakfast clubs rolling out in primary schools. To me, all those announcements feel like a step forward. That said, as some of our listeners may know, we already have measures designed to support pupils from low-income households, such as the pupil premium. But there's always been a suspicion that these sorts of funding streams just end up plugging gaps in existing budgets rather than making a material difference to the lives of children and young people. So what's your sense of the likely impact of what look like pretty big announcements as we now roll forward into 2026?
Yeah, I think these are big announcements, and I think that they will certainly be felt primarily perhaps in the homes of those families at which they are targeted. Our members, head teachers, school and college leaders across the country, may not see the benefit of these immediately. And I suppose this speaks to a message that the Prime Minister has been pushing over this last few days, really, which connects to the vision and that messaging that he has more widely to do in the run-up to the elections that everyone are talking about in May, which will be a real dipstick to see how well the Labour Party are doing. But the reality is, in school, other than the extra money for breakfast clubs, which people were crying out to make sure that they could make ends meet and make them a healthy offer, those other good news items will be things that perhaps our members will witness as students come into school, as young people arrive and are feeling in a better position to learn and are perhaps more school ready. But so much about how people will feel generally, I think, is going to be connected to other factors, which are no doubt connected to teacher pay, funding, and the workforce demands that are placed more broadly on teachers. Because one of the themes towards the end of last year were perhaps that there were a number of asks of the education profession and teachers in particular, schools and colleges in particular, that were perhaps additional demands for us to take on in addition to the learning and the attainment and the achievement and the progress of young people.
Okay, so it doesn't sound like it's impossible we will start to see some benefit from these announcements this year, but it could be that families experience that a bit more than schools and colleges, at least in the short term. From the good news on funding then to some perhaps less good news on funding, because I think we will be hearing a lot over the next few months about teacher pay. Towards the end of last year, the Department for Education proposed a teacher pay award of 6.5% over 3 years, so an average of just over 2% a year, which is in line with government forecasts for wage growth across the economy as a whole, but is still well below the current rate of inflation. And there is also no extra money being offered by the department, so schools and colleges would have to find this money from their current budgets. The School Teachers Review Body, or STRB, will make its independent recommendation on teacher pay in February, with a final decision from the department expected shortly after that. Pepe, the National Education Union, has already said it will hold an indicative ballot on strike action in February in response to, quote, underinflation and underfunded 6.5%. Teachers did get above inflation pay rises in 2024 and 2025, but the stakes for this year still feel very high to me. Do you think we will get through 2026 without strikes by teachers and potentially school and college leaders as well?
That's a very good question, Tom, and it's the million-dollar question, really, that myself and colleagues, both in our executive and also across all the teacher unions, will be reflecting on. We've got several meetings in the next few weeks where we'll be looking at this. And there are a number of factors that come into play. So the first factor will be how and what the STRB has to say and report back in February. The second factor will be what the government then respond in response to the recommendations of the STRB, because you're right to say that teachers did get above inflation pay rises last year, but they are only going some way to redressing the underinflation awards that they've had for nearly a decade in the build-up to that. And to get to a point where teachers were back in 2012 is still some way off. But I think what worries me most and what worries our members most is how much of whatever pay award is agreed will be actually funded, because there is a acknowledgement at the moment that there are reserves in some establishments across the country, but the vast majority of school and college leaders would tell you right now that any pay award that wasn't fully funded is going to have to come out of existing funds, and that is going to come off the tables and the classrooms of young people in schools and colleges up and down the country, and inevitably will result in a deterioration in what the offer is and what they can actually provide in terms of a service for young people. So none of that is good news for anyone, and I can see why that would lead our colleagues in the teaching unions to be considering strike action. I personally think it's a little premature to be doing that now, because until we know what the STRB say and until we know the government response to that, I would hope that we could do whatever we could to make sure that we balance the books, that we got a pay award that was appropriate given the inflation in the country right now, but also given the demands on wider government spending right now, and do all that we could to get through 2026 without strike action.
So one of the interesting threads to this debate over teacher pay is that the number of trainee teachers has increased by 11% this academic year. Now, I think there's a lot of factors that might sit behind that, for example, the wider turmoil in the graduate labour market. But it's also possible that the bigger pay awards we've had over the past couple of years may have attracted more people into the profession as well. And that's one of the reasons why ministers apparently do not feel that another big pay award is needed this year. Just to put some figures on this, the government hit 126% of its target for primary school recruits this year and 88% of its secondary target, although the targets were still hit for core subjects such as English, maths and science, which has definitely not been the case for many of the recent years that we've got data for. So Pepe, on the one hand, this looks like very encouraging news that we've got more people coming into the profession, but I'm wondering how much of an effect that's going to have in 2026 for school and college leaders. Will they feel a tangible impact of this increase in trainee teachers, and will that translate into the better experience for pupils that, as you just said, is what we really want to get to?
Yeah, I mean, this is a critical challenge, because it is true, Tom, that we are seeing more recruits coming into the profession, and government targets, although those targets have been lowered, those targets have been more closely met. They're not widely met. There's still a number of shorted subjects. And I would say that what we need to be careful of when we look at those statistics, and of course there are statistics and then there are damn lies, aren't there, as well, are the number of teachers remaining and being retained within the profession as well, because to me, that is a critical identifying aspect of how well people are doing once they're in the profession. And what we cannot do is recruit our way out of this crisis, because as a poor metaphor, we're going to end up trying to fill a bucket up that's got a hole in the bottom of it that is leaking and unable to retain teachers for any length of period. And as you'll know, the very best teachers need years to gain the experience and the knowledge and understanding to be 110% effective that we'd all want them to be. And whilst it's brilliant that we have additional recruits coming in and we're meeting some of those targets, and no doubt that is connected to the pay awards of the last 2 years, if we are to retain the workforce and make sure that we've got a world-class teaching profession in our country right now, then we need to consider the workload of teachers and how we make sure that the pay for teachers over a lifetime, over the career of a teacher, is appropriate. Because what you aren't seeing in those figures are the applications for headships, the vacancies for leadership positions for deputies and assistant head teachers. And if we have a profession that has got a number of recruits that are coming into it in the greatest motivated and aspirational way, but they don't have those role models or those experienced colleagues around them who can help them develop, who they can aspire to be more like, and are able to help lead them through that profession, then we will end up losing those, as we are seeing in incredibly large amounts after 2, 3 and 4 years at the moment. And I think that's where the focus might well shift in the course of 2026.
Okay, so potentially some good news on recruitment, but that doesn't escape the need to focus on retention and progression as well. So we may be heading for some high-profile debates on teacher pay. As if that wasn't a big enough issue for the government, the potential reforms to the SEND system are likely to prove just as politically challenging, I suspect. Now, we are expecting the government to publish a schools white paper in the coming weeks, which we are told will include reforms to SEND provision. The white paper was expected last autumn, but it got pushed into 2026 as ministers wanted more time to work on their plans. It is also worth saying that we had 2 major announcements on funding for SEND last year, £760 million in last summer's spending review to deliver the upcoming reforms, as well as the dramatic decision in the budget for the government to take over the extra costs of SEND provision, take that away from local authorities from 2028 onwards at a cost of £6 billion. Pepe, SEND provision is a very sensitive issue for many pupils and families around the country, and we've already seen lots of strong lobbying from parents against any reforms that might remove some of the existing entitlements they have to extra support. And yet the financial black hole facing local authorities and some schools and trusts are just inescapable. In my podcast on the SEND reforms at the end of last year, one of my guests even speculated that the reforms might all prove too much for ministers and they might bottle it all together, such as the anxiety in government about upsetting families and maybe teachers and leaders too. So, in your view, is the government heading in the right direction on SEND as we start 2026, or do they need to change course in some way?
No, I truly believe they're heading in the right direction. I can understand why you may have had another guest that might have said that they're worried about the government holding their nerve. There has been a track record with previous bills on welfare in which they haven't, I think, got across their messaging well enough. I've been pleased that they've delayed and paused the white paper, because that's given them the opportunity to talk more to parent groups, to talk more to the profession, because from my experience, we're dealing with an incredibly large proportion of the funding and the investment in education across the sector, as it were. And with more and more needs being identified, both from medical needs, but also educational needs and additional needs that young people are having identified, and more people needing support with their learning through schools. I think that the premise of the white paper and the early thinking behind it is absolutely right. And the fact that they've taken time to speak to people, to make sure that their messaging and that their understanding of the critical factors and the fears that parents have are heard and are addressed, I think is really important and says a lot for the government. It's a very positive aspect. But there's no doubt that the money and sums that we're talking about are mind-blowing. However, those mind-blowing sums at the moment aren't necessarily going in the best interests of young people and are getting to the young people as quickly and as upstream as we'd want. So I think that the way in which we are looking at the early shoots of the white paper and the early drafts of the white paper will help us address that. But I do think that we've got to hold our nerve, because for some parents, they'll be anxious that their children, young people in the system, might end up being worse off in this situation. At the moment, we have a situation where young people have an entitlement through legislation and through law around an EHCP, and we have to make sure that people don't feel like they're going to lose out because of that. But we also have a situation where heads are at their wits' end because they're not able to provide the right sort of support and access the right sort of specialist intervention to help with these young people. And that's generally because of access to the money and the specialist being available for them. So we need to make sure that this white paper addresses a number of different strategies, because not only do individual teachers need to feel that they're better prepared and better equipped to have additional and wider needs in their classroom and be prepared for that, but also head teachers need to make sure that they've got access to specialist support and specialist intervention that they can get to enable young people to come into mainstream schools and be part of mainstream schools that perhaps previously may not have been. And we also need to make sure that we take parents with us on this so that they can see this is going to provide them with something better rather than end up with them with something that might be worse than they've had before. And that is a difficult vision and a difficult argument to make sure that they can feel confident with going forward. And in all of that, you've then got local authorities who have played a massive part in this, and they've been super stretched to deliver this and have been really at the thin end of a wedge in terms of their ability to influence and ability to ensure that young people get the very best support. And I hope that by taking local authorities further away from the centre of the funding of this, and by looking at how we can make sure those funds go to the right people in the right way and get to young people to support them as early as possible, I think we can end up with a far better system. But there's no doubt this is going to take time. It's going to need a great deal of thought. And it's also going to need for people to be patient to see that this is going to come through the system, but be a positive impact and a positive influence going forward than perhaps we've seen in the current SEND system, which by just universal accounts is not good enough and doesn't provide us with a system that we could be proud of.
Yes, I think keeping that focus on what's going to be best for pupils is going to be very challenging when there's lots and lots of competing interests in this space. But hopefully we can get to a good solution. We will wait and see what the white paper has to say. Another issue that may pop up again this year, which already caused a lot of controversy last year, is Ofsted. In fact, the changes to the way that Ofsted inspects schools and colleges were so far-reaching, and in some cases bewildering, I had to do 2 podcasts last year just to try and keep up with everything, not least the serious concerns over the new 5-point grading scale that Ofsted are now using to judge schools, colleges and many other education providers. Pepe, there was a lot of heated debate last year about Ofsted's plans, and I suspect there are still some very strong feelings out there among school and college leaders. But the new inspection system and this new grading scale are now up and running. So where does that leave the debate over Ofsted? Is there anything more to be said in 2026, or has the opposition to Ofsted's plans kind of run out of road at this stage?
Well, I work on the mantra that every day is a learning day, Tom, and I would hope that our friends at Ofsted would be wanting to learn from the first 5 or 6 weeks of inspections. We have to remember that the first month were full of voluntary inspections, so they were people who were asking to be inspected. And then we've had about 10 days of inspections in December where we'll have had the first, what I would call proper inspections. And I think we have to collate the information from that. We're asking on behalf of our members to hear feedback from that. But inspections will really hit the ground running this week with colleagues getting phone calls as we speak. And I think we need to take stock of what we're hearing, learn from the experiences of people on the ground. And I'd want to be working with our colleagues at Ofsted to see what we can do to make sure we can make this new revised framework as good as it possibly can be. It was tweaked, it was changed in the year in the build-up to its inauguration in September. And I think it's important that we don't leave it where it is. other previous inspections and previous frameworks have been years in the making, and this has come through quite quickly. And I think some of the early concerns that you will have no doubt heard on previous podcasts were about a lack of transparency, the lack of openness, and the speed at which some of the decisions were made about the introduction of the framework. I would hope that we would see a renewed openness and a willingness to look at what inspections are telling us, but also what head teachers are telling us from their experiences of the new framework and the new inspection process. And I think it's fair to say, early days, we're hearing some good feedback that people are saying it is a more positive, it's a more open, discursive inspection process. But from certain quarters, perhaps heads of small primary schools who haven't got necessarily big teams to call upon to support them on the actual ground during the process, it's being declared that it's a really tough process for them to go through and a high pressure process. And I think what we'd want to do is try and learn from that, make sure that we could support those individuals in their context that are finding this more challenging, to make sure that it's a fair and reasonable process for them. And we have to remember that the whole premise for the reorganisation and the revision of the framework centred on the death of a head teacher and the well-being of a head teacher. And we shouldn't ever forget that. We need to make sure that whatever we bring in is cognizant of that, takes acknowledgement of that, and make sure that it is a process that works not only for parents, not only for the inspectorate and the wider country, but also works for the profession as well, so that we can feel proud that we're able to show what we're doing well in schools, to celebrate what's going brilliantly in some of our schools, but also have an openness and a reflection on what we need to improve on. And that comes from an inspection process that is done with the profession and not done to the profession. And so I'm looking forward to positive discussions with Ofsted. We're already reaching out and they're open to this to make sure that we can review the early findings. And I would hope that in the coming months, we'd be seeing a reflection on what's happened and maybe even some tweaks and some changes going forward.
Well, as you were saying earlier, if we can't convince people to be head teachers, then the whole system is going to lose out. So well-being, you would hope, will remain a focus for everybody concerned as we roll forward. It wasn't just Ofsted, of course, that got people talking at the end of last year, because we also had the final report from the Curriculum and Assessment Review. It took me a whole podcast episode in October to discuss all the main recommendations from the review, unsurprisingly. But as we look forward into 2026, we now move into the implementation phase of the reforms. To remind our listeners, the underpinning principle of the review was evolution, not revolution. But when you add together all the upcoming changes, such as reforming school accountability measures, introducing new V-level qualifications as early as 2027, a greater focus on oracy, changing the national curriculum, adding more citizenship into primary schools, all of a sudden this looks to me like quite a large package of reforms at a time when school and college leaders are grappling with many other financial and educational issues. So, Pepe, is 2026 the right time for government to put its foot to the floor and be pushing ahead with these reforms when it comes to the curriculum, the assessment system, the accountability system? Or is it just going to end up piling even more pressure onto teachers and leaders, even if they actually agree with the reforms in principle?
Well, I think even the way in which you formatted the question there, Tom, suggests there's an awful lot to be getting on with at the moment. And the phrase I used before Christmas was that we had a tsunami of policy coming through, and that continues with the imminent white paper that we're expecting and anticipating. And on the back of the Curriculum Assessment Review, I think what we would say is that most of the recommendations we were broadly in favour of. We welcomed them. We were lucky enough to be doing our autumn leadership conferences at ASCL at the time of the announcement of the Curriculum Assessment Review. So I had the opportunity to meet with over 1,000 colleagues up and down the country in all the different regions. And by and large, many of the recommendations were well received. Where we've had some challenge and some pushback is in the government's interpretation and selection of some of those recommendations. So you mentioned accountability measures, you mentioned Progress 8. I think we've got some concerns about where the government are looking to change Progress 8, looking to adjust accountability measures, because we feel that Professor Francis's recommendations seem to be sensible and seem to be making sense for the wider profession, and also enabling a more balanced view about accountability and hopefully allowing young people to have a range of different options within the curriculum and really lift that pedal of pressure off head teachers when it comes to the curriculum they're able to offer and provide, particularly in Key Stage 4. We welcomed many of the recommendations around post-16. We're excited to see what V levels might look like and how they might come to be. But again, there's been an awful lot of change at post-16, and it's important that we take people with us to make sure that our post-16 offer not only reflects those changes pre-16, but also helps prepare young people for what is a fast-moving world of work and careers beyond 18, 19, 20. And it's important that we're able to give the support to the post-16 sector to make sure that they're able to deliver what these V levels may look like, but also have a range of qualifications that are appropriate and flexible for young people to move between them as well as through them. Because as you and I both know, when you're 16, you may well consider yourself that you want to be an astronaut, but actually during the process of going through your astrophysics and your maths and perhaps your chemistry to train and qualify to do that, reality may well hit hard and you may well choose a different A-level or a different vocational qualification. And you need to have the flexibility to move around those modules and move through those modules without feeling that you've got to go back 2 steps in order to move forward 3 steps. So I think the reforms are broadly welcomed. I think what will be interesting will be Ofqual's latest consultation around on-screen assessment and where that goes. I think I'm due to talk at the BET conference in the next couple of weeks. And it'll be interesting to see what people feel about digital assessment, online assessment and on-screen assessment, because there is definitely a future there, I think, in the way that we can look at adaptive assessment so that we can get a better understanding about what young people know and look at that through a digital lens rather than perhaps the Victorian way in which we set exams through pen and paper at the moment. So I think that's going to be interesting for the year ahead, and be interesting to see what the consultation comes forward from Ofqual in saying that. But by and large, really happy with the curriculum assessment review. Our main job, I think, going forward is, as you hinted, really, is to help school and college leaders navigate those recommendations over a time frame that works for them, because some of the recommendations around citizenship will need to be in place. People will need to be qualified, trained, have professional development and have the appropriate strategies in order to deliver some of those recommendations in the next 2 years. Other aspects around oracy and media training are also going to need us to make sure that we are appropriately trained and prepared for those being introduced. And that will take time and will take professional development for teachers on the ground at the same time as the new Ofsted framework, the new white paper and the SEND reforms and all the other things that we spoke about earlier on in this podcast. So all of that needs just working through carefully to allow people to keep their heads above water during it, feel like they're moving in the right direction.
Yes, certainly plenty to juggle there through 2026. Okay, we are almost at the end of our discussion, so it's time for my last question for today. As we've discussed, the opening few months of 2026 are set to be a very busy period with some major decisions expected to be made by ministers, not all of which will necessarily please teachers, leaders and parents at the same time. And no doubt there'll be many other announcements or initiatives and debates that will emerge as we roll through the next 12 months. It is worth reiterating that the government did show at the end of last year they can still make progress on important issues when they feel the need to act, so there are absolutely reasons to be positive as well. So my question is, which one area or issue are you most optimistic about for schools and colleges as we go into 2026? And which issue are you most concerned about for this year?
Well, I think the easy answer to that, Tom, is that I'm most optimistic about the white paper and how that will impact upon SEND. I suppose I could also say that I'm most concerned about that because we need to get it right. It's so important that we get it right. It's so important that we deliver something that's better than what we've had previously, and that young people get better support and that head teachers feel that they're empowered to deliver that support on the ground. Because I do truly believe that young people are better off wherever possible in a mainstream school, in their local community school, not travelling for hours on end out of their local communities. They need to be in schools with people on the streets that they live with and people in the areas that they grow up with and connecting with those people. So I'm excited by what the white paper brings and all that it aspires to achieve for those young people who are often some of the most vulnerable people and some of the most disadvantaged in our schools right now and in our societies right now. I suppose if I'm going to pick one area that I am most concerned about, it is connected to falling roles, actually. what we're seeing in the country at the moment in a variety of different areas for different reasons, particularly coming through our primary schools, is a massive impact of smaller groups, the birth rates having reduced in the way that they have. And there are several schools, whether that be in central London, other schools perhaps in tourist areas that are heavily taken over by Airbnbs and families are no longer living in those areas. Those schools are being massively impacted by the numbers of young people living and growing up in those areas. And without us creating a strategic response to that, we are going to see, if we're not careful, schools withering on the vine and not being able to keep their head above water for the funding reasons we spoke about earlier. And I think that we really need to address a strategy there, a national strategy, to help manage that, navigate that process, because it is going to see the death of several of our village schools and our community schools in these areas, perhaps that are more regionally diverse and exposed, but also in central areas of urban areas as well, where people are moving out of those areas and birth rates are also hitting those areas too. So certainly a big topic for us to look at that I don't think is on the radar at the moment.
Thank you, Pepe, and thanks so much for giving us your verdict on what 2026 may bring for schools and colleges. It's been great having you on the podcast.
Been an absolute pleasure, Tom, and I hope I haven't rambled on too long, and hopefully I've got through this nasty cough that's come through as well.
Oh, I'm sure our listeners won't mind at all. It is that time of year. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode. If you enjoyed my conversation with Pepe, then please do share it with other people and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.